What you're about to see is a sealed room in upstate New York that almost no one dares to enter, and what's inside will leave you questioning reality. Every corner of this abandoned place holds stories that are real, chilling, and unlike anything you've ever imagined, and I was standing right there. Have you ever wondered what secrets old, abandoned places hide? Today, I'm taking you inside a sealed room in upstate New York that almost no one talks about. I felt chills just standing there. Every corner tells a story, real, haunting, and unlike anything you've ever seen. Stay with me. If you love real haunted stories and abandoned secrets, make sure to subscribe and join me on every chilling adventure. 1 Buffalo State Hospital. I remember the first time I stood in front of Buffalo State Hospital in Buffalo, New York. The building didn't look like a hospital. It looked like a castle that had been waiting for something, or someone. The tall towers and heavy stone walls made the sky behind it look smaller. I had seen pictures before, but standing there felt different. It felt heavier. Buffalo State Hospital was opened in 1880. It was designed by architect Henry Hobson Richardson, and it followed the Kirkbride plan. A system meant to treat mental illness with light, air, and long open wings. When it first opened, people believed this place would heal minds. Over time, that hope changed. As I walked along the outside of the old complex, I noticed how large the property really was. Multiple connected wards stretched out in long lines. Some parts have now been restored into the Richardson Hotel, but for decades many wings were abandoned and sealed off. Not for ghost reasons. For structural damage, safety issues, and neglect. That's where the feeling begins. During the mid-1900s, the hospital became overcrowded. At one point, thousands of patients were living here, far more than the original design allowed. Treatment methods changed over time. Some were humane for their era. Others, like early electrotherapy and isolation practices, are difficult to read about today. Many patients spent years here. Some never left. When the hospital began shutting down sections in the 1970s, entire wards were closed and locked. Windows were boarded. Doors were chained. Records were moved, but not always carefully. Staff slowly transferred patients elsewhere, and parts of the building were simply left behind. I was told by a local guide that before renovation began in the 2000s, urban explorers used to sneak inside. They described long empty corridors where paint peeled from the ceiling, and patient rooms still had numbers above the doors. Some areas were sealed completely because floors were unstable. No dramatic conspiracy. Just decay. But when you stand near those closed wings, knowing thousands of real people once lived and struggled inside, the silence feels different. It doesn't feel empty. It feels paused. There was one section in particular, a long rear ward. That remained inaccessible for years during redevelopment. Workers had to carefully stabilize it before anyone could safely enter again. Standing near that area, I kept thinking about the patients who may have looked out from those same windows a century ago. Not ghosts. Real people. People who were sent here during a time when mental illness was misunderstood. People whose letters, fears, and hopes are now stored in archives instead of memories. The building today is partially restored and beautiful again. But when the wind moves through the older stone walls, it carries something heavy with it. Not something supernatural. Something human. And sometimes, that feels even more haunting. 2 Willard Asylum. I still remember the drive toward Willard. The road felt longer than it should have. When I finally saw the old buildings of Willard Asylum for the chronic insane in Willard, New York, they didn't look dramatic or cinematic. They looked tired. Like a place that had carried too many stories for too long. Willard opened in 1869. It was built for patients who were labeled chronic, people who were expected to never recover. That word alone stayed in my mind as I walked near the property. Chronic. Permanent. Forgotten. For over a century, thousands of men and women lived there. Some were sent because they truly needed psychiatric care. Others were committed for reasons that would shock us today: poverty, epilepsy, postpartum depression, even just being difficult. Many families never came back. When I first learned about the Willard suitcases, I thought it was just an urban legend. It wasn't. In 1995, workers cleaning an attic in one of the buildings found more than 400 suitcases. They belonged to former patients. The luggage was labeled with their names. Inside were shoes, letters, photographs, hairbrushes, small personal items. Everything packed as if they believed they would one day go home. They never did. Standing near the old structures, knowing those suitcases had sat untouched for decades above patient wards, made the air feel heavier. No ghost story was needed. The truth was enough. Those belongings were real. Those names were real. Some of those patients had died at Willard and were buried in numbered graves on the grounds, without family markers. As I walked closer to one of the older, restricted sections, I noticed boarded windows and locked doors. Parts of the campus were closed for safety reasons. Floors were unstable. Paint peeled from the walls. It wasn't dramatic horror. It was slow abandonment. I kept imagining one specific moment: a patient arriving in the late 1800s, stepping out of a carriage with a suitcase in hand. Maybe she believed treatment would help. Maybe he thought it was temporary. That suitcase would later sit in an attic for 70 years. That thought followed me as I stood there. The wind moved through broken edges of the property and made a low sound against the brick. For a second, I understood why people call this place haunted. Not because of shadows. Not because of ghosts caught on camera. But because of unfinished lives. Willard officially closed in 1995. More than 126 years of history ended quietly. The buildings remain, some sealed, some crumbling. The suitcases are now preserved by the New York State Museum. The names are recorded. But when you stand near those locked doors, knowing hundreds of personal stories were once hidden above the ceilings, it feels like the building is still holding its breath. And sometimes, silence like that feels louder than any scream. 3 Hudson River State Hospital. The first time I saw Hudson River State Hospital in Poughkeepsie, it didn't look like a hospital. It looked like something out of a dark fairy tale. The tall Gothic towers stood against the gray sky, and for a moment I just stayed inside my car, staring at it. The hospital opened in 1871. Back then, it was called the Hudson River State Hospital for the Insane. It followed the Kirkbride plan, which meant long wings spreading out from a central building. The idea was simple: light, fresh air, and order would help patients recover. Standing there more than a century later, I kept thinking about how hopeful that must have sounded in the beginning. As I walked along the edge of the property, I could see how massive it really was. At its peak, thousands of patients lived there. Overcrowding became a serious problem in the 1900s. Treatment methods changed over time, and like many institutions of that era, not all of them would be accepted today. That part is documented history. It's not rumor. By the late 20th century, sections of the hospital were closing. Some wards were completely shut down. Windows were boarded up. Doors were locked and left untouched for years. When I stood near one of the older, sealed wings, I felt something strange. Not fear exactly. More like weight. I had read that before redevelopment started in the 2010s, large parts of the complex were abandoned and considered unsafe. Floors were collapsing. Paint peeled off in long strips. Urban explorers had posted photos years ago showing empty hallways, metal bed frames, and long corridors that seemed to stretch forever. Many of those areas were later secured and sealed off for safety. As I moved closer to the central building, I imagined what it must have sounded like in 1900. Footsteps in the hallway. Nurses calling out names. Patients looking through those same windows toward the Hudson River. Some of them likely believed they would leave soon. Some stayed for decades. That thought stayed with me. There is also a cemetery on the grounds, where former patients were buried. Many graves were marked only with numbers instead of names. That is not fiction. That is part of the record. Knowing that made the silence feel different. The wind moved through broken edges of old brick and made a hollow sound. For a second, I understood why people described this place as haunted. But what felt haunting to me was not a shadow or a whisper. It was the idea of time stopping inside those sealed wards. The hospital officially closed in 2003. Parts of it have since been redeveloped into housing. But some original structures were too damaged and had to be demolished. Others stood empty for years, locked and forgotten. When I finally walked away and looked back at those towers, I didn't feel like I had visited a horror location. I felt like I had stood in front of a memory that never fully healed. For Binghamton State Hospital. I remember the first time I approached Binghamton State Hospital. The road leading up to it twisted through trees that blocked the sky, and when the buildings finally came into view, they seemed to rise straight from the earth like dark monuments. Even in daylight, the complex felt heavy, like it carried the weight of 100 years of stories. The hospital opened in 1858, long before modern psychiatry existed. It was built to house people considered insane at the time. Walking along the perimeter, I could imagine how the original grounds were carefully planned with the Kirkbride design, long wings extending from a central building, meant to give patients fresh air and light. That was the theory. In reality, thousands of people lived cramped inside, some for decades, some for life. When I first stepped near one of the older, closed wings, the air felt different. There was a quiet that wasn't just absence of sound. It was heavy, layered with memory. I thought about the patients who once walked those halls, calling out for someone to hear them, for a family member who might never come, for a treatment that didn't always help. Parts of the hospital were sealed in the mid-20th century when sections became unsafe. Floors rotted, ceilings collapsed, and some doors were chained shut. Standing outside one of those sealed areas, I tried to picture the rooms behind the boards. I could almost feel the lingering presence of everyday life, small acts of hope, tiny personal rituals, frozen in time. I read later that urban explorers who entered these areas described long hallways where bed frames sat rusting, where graffiti told new stories over the old, and where faint whispers of the past seemed to follow them. Some claimed shadows moved oddly in the corner of their vision. I didn't see anything like that when I was there. But the silence itself felt haunted. I wandered toward the cemetery on the hospital grounds, where many patients were buried. The markers were numbered, not named. It was factual, not fiction, but it hit harder than any horror story. Thousands of lives, reduced to numbers, memories fading into the ground itself. As I walked back, the wind moved through the old brick walls, making low, hollow noises. For a moment, I could almost hear the echo of steps, not threatening, but human, the sound of life that once filled the building. And that's when it hit me, this place wasn't haunted by spirits. It was haunted by memory. By the weight of decades of human lives confined, forgotten, and slowly sealed away. Even after leaving, I couldn't shake the feeling that Binghamton State Hospital had left a mark on me. The building stood silent, some still abandoned, some partially restored, but the air around them carried a reminder, real life can be far more haunting than any ghost story. 5 Kings Park Psychiatric Center. I still remember the day I first approached Kings Park Psychiatric Center in Kings Park, New York. The sun was low in the sky, and the long shadows of the tall brick building stretched across the overgrown lawn. From a distance, it looked quiet, almost peaceful. But the closer I got, the heavier the air felt. It wasn't the wind. It was something else, a weight built from decades of stories, suffering, and human lives left behind. Kings Park opened in 1885. At the time, it was a model institution, designed to care for the mentally ill with the latest medical ideas. Its sprawling campus followed the Kirkbride design, with long wings meant to provide sunlight, air, and space. Standing there, I could picture hundreds of patients walking along the halls, some hopeful, some resigned. Many of them would spend the majority of their lives there. By the mid-20th century, the hospital had expanded into a complex of multiple buildings, housing thousands. Some wings became overcrowded, and treatment methods changed with time. What was once considered cutting-edge often became harsh or inhumane by modern standards. Isolation rooms, locked wards, and strict routines were part of daily life for patients. Walking toward one of the abandoned wings, I noticed boarded windows and chained doors. These sections had been sealed after they were deemed unsafe, years before redevelopment began. The silence around these areas was different from the rest of the campus. It wasn't just quiet. It was a quiet heavy with memory. I imagined walking those long, empty corridors, imagining the patients whose footsteps once echoed there. I learned that parts of Kings Park were notorious among urban explorers. They described empty hallways, broken furniture, and peeling paint. Some even spoke of hearing faint whispers or footsteps where no one could be. I didn't experience that, but the stories made the walls feel alive in a strange, human way. Not haunted by spirits, but haunted by what was left behind. By thousands of lives recorded only in documents and fading photographs. There is also a cemetery on the grounds, with markers that record patient names and numbers. Many graves mark people who spent their entire lives in the hospital, never seeing family again. Standing there, I realized that real history can feel more haunting than any horror story. Each grave, each sealed wing, represented real humans, with hopes, fears, and lives that are gone but not forgotten. Even after I left, the image of those brick towers against the fading sun stayed with me. The air around Kings Park carried the echo of time, and though the hospital now mostly stands silent or repurposed, the sense of presence, human, raw, real, lingers. Walking those grounds, I understood why people call it haunted. It isn't the shadows. It isn't the ghosts. It's the memory of the people who lived, suffered, and were sealed into the history of Kings Park Psychiatric Center.